Let's jump into some of the major events of the Middle Ages. Just a word on the word, the term medieval. It implies that there's something before and after it, right? We often think that the part that came after the Middle Ages is our time. That's only half true. The folks who gave us the term medieval and Middle Ages were the Renaissance scholars of Italy. And they referred to their own time as a rebirth of interest in classical culture, Greco-Roman culture. Their own time was a rebirth, a renaissance. And they loved to study that classical time, that ancient time that we studied on Tuesday. And the time in between the ancient period and their own period, they just called the middle period. And they looked askance on the middle period as inferior when there was little research and culture and good art and scholarship. And we've sort of inherited that view of the Middle Ages, which I think is a little unfair because it hides the fact that there's tons of things happening through this medieval period. Medieval, the word just means Middle Age. All right. So what happened throughout this long period of the Middle Ages, which goes from 500 to 1500 AD? We're going to look at several things. I mentioned the conversion of the Northern Europeans. There were several tribes in Northern Europe and Scandinavia. Most of them were converted between 300 and 700 AD. And I've listed some of the major groups and the times when they were converted to Christianity. You'll notice the Goths, there are two dates listed. The Goths were converted to a form of Christianity that was heretical. It was following the heretic Arius that we studied on Tuesday, who said that Christ was not eternal like God the Father. So they were converted to Arian Christianity, and then they were reconverted to what we would call Catholic or Orthodox Christianity, a belief that Christ, God the Father, and the Holy Spirit are all eternal. And that took place 400 years later in 720. You've heard of St. Patrick. He was an Englishman who converted a lot of the Irish to Christianity in the 5th century. The Franks are the ancestors of the French and some of the Germans. They were converted around 500. The Angles and Saxons, many of whom settled in Scandinavia and what's today the United Kingdom, were converted beginning in 600 AD through a guy named Augustine of Canterbury. Not the same Augustine we studied Tuesday, different one. And then the Frisians, who were in what's now the Netherlands, were converted in 690. There were some who came even later, some in northern Scandinavia, the Lithuanians. Others will come hundreds of years even after this. But the majority of Northern Europeans were converted during this time period. The rival religion of Islam arises in the 600s, in the mid 600s. It's based on revelations received by Muhammad, who was an Arabian merchant. He was a trader, and he would meditate in a cave near the town of Mecca. And he started to receive revelations from the angel Gabriel. That's what he believed they were. And he proceeded to share those revelations with others and convert them to a monotheistic faith that he felt was a continuation of Judaism and Christianity. So he felt that he was receiving divine revelations from the same God of the Jews and Christians, and he was receiving new revelation. So he very quickly converted many of those around him from polytheism to this new faith, which he called Islam, which means submission. The God of Islam is named Allah. We've learned a lot about Islam in the last couple decades here, even in the West, because of our tense clashes with that religion. But we shouldn't read too much of our present experience of Islam and Muslims into the past. It wasn't always as it is now. So Islam spread very quickly. And one of the reasons it spread was it brought unity to the scattered tribes of North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula and even Mesopotamia and into Asia. And the the people who spread the faith, the Islamic faith, spread it through conquest as much as through persuasion. So they would often, coerce and force people they conquered to convert or to have to pay a tax. to have to live as lower status citizens. And it's fair to say Christians did the same thing when they carried the faith into Northern Europe and other places. Sometimes they did so by force, right? Force whole villages and communities to convert. But you see, within 100 years, Islam spread very quickly throughout North Africa into even what's now Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, into Mesopotamia, and almost as far as India. What's interesting is a lot of the churches that had been established in North Africa were completely extinguished. The Christians converted to Islam, either through force or through persuasion. One exception is the churches in Egypt and Ethiopia. Many of them were Coptic Christians, and they remain very heartily steadfast in their Christian faith and still do today. They are a very hardy church in Egypt, especially in Egypt. Some of the basic principles of Islam, many of the practices of Islam are taken from Judaism and Christianity as it was practiced in the Near East in Muhammad's time. He had contact with Jews and Christians. You see a man praying here. He's bowing down and praying. That was a common practice of Christians and Jews in the Near East. The giving of alms, many of the basic principles of Islamic worship, giving of alms, fasting, prayer, repeated prayer throughout the day at set times. Many of those things were things that Jews and Christians were doing as they practiced their Christian faith in the places where Muslims conquered. So one could argue that they maybe got a lot of those things from the Jews and Christians they interacted with. What was life like for Christians under Muslim rule? Well, it was a mixed bag. And in the earlier centuries of Muslim conquest, it was generally easier. In fact, there are a few examples in history when Muslims were in charge, and yet Jews and Christians both were allowed to thrive, to prosper, and even to study and debate alongside Muslim scholars. And a lot of Muslim scholars translated and discussed Greek philosophy and some of the ancient works of the Roman world, the Greek world. In fact, it's probably due to this Islamic interest in Greek philosophy that we now know so much about Aristotle, because they were sort of the keepers of Aristotle's writings until the 1200s, when Europeans came into contact with those writings again through contact with Muslims. All right, so life was generally easier for Christians in the first centuries of Muslim rule, but as Islam grew stronger and the rule of Muslims grew stronger over the centuries, there were times of sporadic and very cruel persecution of Christians and Jews. And then when we get to the period of the Crusades and the Mongol invasions, there will be some very, very fierce and destructive persecution of Christian communities that are living under Muslim rule. Moving on, a very important thing occurred in Europe in 800. In that year, one of the Franks rulers named Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, was crowned emperor and king of a new Roman Empire, a revived Roman Empire, which would later come to be called the Holy Roman Empire. He was crowned by the Pope as the king. So for the next several centuries, there would be a close and sometimes strained relationship between the popes and the Franks and those living in this Holy Roman Empire, which eventually took on the shape roughly of modern Germany. It was north of Italy. Of course, the Pope was in Italy, in Rome. So the Holy Roman Empire will be one of the power players in the political history of Europe. And for many, this was a revival of the Roman Empire, and now it was a Christian empire, as it had been originally towards the end. In reality, there was very little similarity between the new Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire of before, of the ancient world. But they like to call it that. Okay, Charlemagne and the Franks are significant because they brought a lot of Europe together at a time when so much of Europe was divided into little, I talked about manors, the feudal system, different tribes on the move, settling in different places. Charlemagne and the Franks, for a long time, ruled the largest section of land in Europe. In the 900s, I should say by the 900s, there were a lot of monasteries throughout Europe and the East, but many of them were experiencing sort of a lagging spirit. A lot of monks were not exhibiting the same rigor that they had in previous centuries. There was also a sense in the church that clergy were not carrying out their responsibilities completely. They were not the spiritual pastors that they should be. And into those circumstances came a revival among monks. And what started it was the establishment of a monastery, an abbey, in Cluny, France. There was a king and his wife who gifted this monastery to the monks and basically told them, you do whatever you want, you write whatever you want, you say whatever you want. You are free to run this place as you wish. And that was a novelty. Usually monasteries were funded by royalty, by nobles, and there was the expectation that they wouldn't rock the boat, they wouldn't criticize nobles. But here was something different. They were really given autonomy and independence. And with that freedom, they did begin to mount some needed criticisms of the church, some things that needed to be reformed. And they tried to reinvigorate monasticism, to get back to the spirit and the determination and passion of some of the earlier monastics from the ancient period. And this spirit spread throughout Europe. Cluniac monasteries and a Cluny approach spread throughout Europe. Eventually, monks who had been inspired by this reform movement would gain high positions in the church and even become popes within the Roman Catholic Church. So it was kind of a shot in the arm for the church in the 900s. Something very unfortunate occurred not long after in 1054. There had been a growing divide between the churches in the East, based in Constantinople, and the churches in Europe, based in Rome. And these two churches split in 1054 over several differences. There were cultural differences. The church in the West used Latin in its services. The church in the East used Greek. They also had different emphases theologically. The church in the West tended to, based on certain aspects of Roman law, they tended to recast theological discussions in a legal framework and even to view salvation in legal terms. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. In the East, they saw salvation as more in terms of the image of God in man and the fact that sin had ruined that image, and that by following Christ in this life, one can begin to restore that image of God and approach a sort of divine status. So they just had different emphases. And then what the straw that broke the camel's back was that the Eastern Christians complained that the Roman Catholic Church was saying one of the creeds wrong. And it was saying specifically that the Holy Spirit came from the Father and the Son. And they insisted that that phrase, and the Son, was not in the original creed. The Spirit doesn't come from the Father and the Son. He is sent forth by the Father. So that, again, that sounds like a little issue to us. It was a big deal to them. And that, on top of several other things, led to a split. And basically, the two churches excommunicated one another. And they were estranged from that point on in history. And from the map here, you can see what areas each one represented. I want to say a few words about Eastern Orthodoxy, because for the rest of the time, we'll be focusing mostly on Catholicism and then Protestantism next week. As I said, Eastern Orthodox Christians, they see salvation slightly differently than we do in the West, both Catholics and Protestants. They don't think of it in terms of a legal agreement. You know, Christians have broken God's law. We're guilty, and we need to have some sort of legal remedy. And Christ provides the legal remedy by paying for our sins. There's some of that in their beliefs, but they focus more on, again, the image of God in in us. We are the image of God, and by sin corrupts that image. And by getting back into fellowship with God, we're brought back into communion with him, and we begin to take on the divine image again. It's not that they think we're becoming God, but we're becoming like him, they would say. They call it divinization. So salvation is the process of coming closer and closer back to God and the image of God. And that carries over into their use of icons, which I'm going to talk about a little more. Of course, an icon is a picture of a saint or someone in the Bible or some concept from the Bible. And it is an image. It's an image of something divine. And that's in keeping with their focus on image. Christ came as the image of God in a body. We live as the image of God. The Eastern Orthodox succeeded in converting the Russian people in the 10th century. This is a painting representing the baptism of Vladimir, their king, in 987. That's why, of course, the biggest branch of Eastern Orthodoxy today is in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church. One other thing I'll mention about Eastern Orthodoxy, the Orthodox also see a bigger connection between church and state. That goes back to Constantine. Constantine built the city of Constantinople, and that's where, for a long time, Constantinople was a second Rome, considered a second Rome. And the emperor was considered the head of the church. So Eastern Orthodox are much more at home with the marriage of church and state, and the idea that the king, the monarch, the emperor, is Christ's representative on earth, as a judge and ruler, more so than we do in the West. All right, got some bad news to cover. Several troublesome developments occurred in the High and Late Middle Ages, which caused a lot of tension between East and West, and caused a lot of trouble for churches in the East that spread out from Jerusalem east. The Crusades were campaigns of European Christians to go and recapture the Holy Land, Palestine, Jerusalem, Syria. And these occurred during a 200-year period starting in 1096, going to about 1291. It all started when the emperor it was the patriarch, the equivalent of the Pope in the Eastern Orthodox Church, asked for help because he was getting heat put on him from Muslim invaders. He asked for help from the Pope and from Europeans. And if he had known what was going to happen, he might not have done so, but he asked for help. And so Pope Urban II in 1096, that's a typo, it should say the Council of Clermont 1096, he called the Christian people of Europe to go and fight these Muslim forces and recapture the Holy Land. And so for the next 200 years, that's what different groups and armies of Europeans tried to do. They did capture some of the lands of Palestine for a time, and they set up European Christian kingdoms, but they lost those within 100 years or 200 years. So as far as seizing land, the Crusades were an ultimate failure. But what's worse is the Crusades had the effect of hurting relationships, not only with Muslims in the East and Europeans, but also Western Christians, Europeans, Catholics, and Christians in the East and Jews in the East, because the Crusaders would often treat Jews and Christians in the East that they encountered just as badly as they did the Muslims. They were they were not discriminating in the way they treated those peoples. And so a lot of bad blood was created because of that. The Mongols were a very interesting tribe of Asians from what's now Eastern China and Mongolia. And they invaded their own territory and then moved west. And between 1200 and 1400, they came into contact with Europeans and with a lot of the Christians in the East. At first, the Christians experienced an improvement in their circumstances because of the Mongols. Some of them were killed. Sometimes the Mongols could be very cruel. But once things had settled down, most of the Mongols were actually very kind to the Christians, and some Mongols even became Christians. However, in the 1300s, things took a definite turn, and most Mongols became Muslim. And after that point, there's severe persecution of Christians in the East. We add to that the effect of the tension between Muslim communities in the East caused by the Crusades, and the result was severe, very cruel and devastating and thorough persecution of Christian communities in the East. I wanted to show you this map. All these little dots, I don't know how well you can see it, represent churches and communities of Christians stretching from Jerusalem east. You can see there's some on the Arabian Peninsula, there's some down in India, right, all the way across Asia along what we'd call the Silk Road into China. There was even some in Japan. And most of these were affiliated with the Church of the East, who broke off from the Council of Ephesus in 431. But most of these communities were wiped out by the 14th century because of Mongol attacks, particularly those of Timur, who's here on the right, also known as Tamerlane. His reign was very devastating for Christian communities. And there's a phenomenon that when Muslim communities were being attacked by Christian armies, say the European Christian armies, they suddenly turned on the Christians in their own midst, who had lived with them for generations and generations. And they looked with suspicion now on those Christian communities because they thought perhaps these Christians will ally with these Christians who are attacking us. And so they were treated very poorly. And we see that pattern again and again and again. Anytime a Muslim community, and it's the same with a Christian community, anytime it's attacked from the outside, it begins to look at people who are in the same group as the attacker with suspicion and treat them very poorly. All right, so between the Crusaders and the Mongol invasions, it got very, very rough for Christians in the East, and many communities were simply wiped out. More bad news. I told you there's a lot of bad news. The Black Death occurred in the mid-1300s. This was a spread of a plague. It killed somewhere between a third, some people even think as much as half of the population of Europe, millions and millions of people. And of course, you would expect this had an effect on the way people viewed their faith. This was undermining to the faith of a lot of folks. They thought it was judgment from God. People began to have a preoccupation with death because they felt life was very short and unpredictable, as anyone would think after an experience like this. So from this time, we see images like you see here, which is called the Dance of Death, which expresses just the pervasiveness of death. Some whole villages were wiped out by the plague, and others were hardly touched. If you look at the map, you see areas that's now Poland, the city of Milan in North Italy. Almost none of them were touched by the plague, so it was kind of a mysterious thing. Probably came in part to Europe because of the Mongols and the contact between East and West. So the Black Death was very devastating, wiped out a big part of the population. Finally, last bit of doom and gloom I'll share. There was a war between France and its allies and England and its allies that lasted about 100 years, called appropriately the 100 Years' War. It's actually a little more than 100 years. This is where Henry V and Joan of Arc, a young French woman who led French forces in battle, gained their fame. And this was significant because both France and England have different alliances with the Italian popes. And depending on their alliances, that will affect the way the other nation, their relationship with the popes. So for a while, the French have a very close relationship with the popes. Therefore, the English, their relationship with Italy and the popes becomes a little colder because of this relationship. So very devastating war, and it led to the rise of professional armies, among other things, in Europe. So some of the big events. I'm going to talk about another sort of gloomy thing that occurred in the church called the Western Schism in a minute.